30 minutes, 45, whatever.
Great.
Yeah, so heads up, we're live now with Lindsey Burke, myself, Corey DeAngelis, and Matthew Nielsen. We're just kind of chilling for now, as we usually do, to wait to make sure a lot of people hop on before we actually jump into it. And I guess we'll be on here for about 30 to 45 minutes, depending on how it goes. Obviously, it'll go really well because this is Lindsey Burke. The education director at Heritage Foundation, but Matthew will get into her formal introduction soon. But I think we've reached the peak of our podcast. I think we could just stop the podcast after we do this one because Lindsey Burke.
I don't know. You have some pretty solid people on. Didn't you have Angela Dills? She's fantastic.
Yeah. Yep. Angela Dills is great. Everybody that we have on here is great, obviously. Lindsey Burke's also affiliated with the Educational Freedom Institute as one of the board of directors. So that everybody knows, this is a full-fledged EFI podcast today. All three of us are EFI people.
Yeah, it's cool. We're excited to have you, Lindsey. Thanks for jumping on for a little bit this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, what do you think, Corey? Are we good? Should we make some introductions? And how's it looking?
It's doing okay. It's so early in the morning. I just rolled out of bed, so maybe people are still waking up. I mean, we have a few people on. It's going higher. I guess people are excited about Lindsey Burke, obviously, and me waking up. And I would show my dog right now. He's chilling next to me because that's all he does these days. But I'm not going to.
You should tell our viewers about poor Radar having to be carried up 6 flights of stairs every day.
Yeah, our elevator broke at the condo at the worst time ever. The least convenient time because of the coronavirus and the parts have to come from Finland. So the elevator's broken. I'm on the 3rd floor. And my dog Radar is a border collie. He's 14 years old, almost 14 and a half now. And he can't do the stairs by himself, so I have to pick him up. And every time we go to the restroom, or he goes to the restroom at least, got to bring him up and down the stairs. And he's 55 pounds, but
he's big.
Yeah, he's big for a border collie too. So okay,
the gym is closed, so you've got that now.
Yeah, it's about it, right? I mean, go up and down the stairs. Okay, so I think enough with that. I think we could start with introductions now. We got a pretty good amount of people on.
All right, cool. So I'm Matthew Nielsen. I'm the board chair at the Educational Freedom Institute, and welcome everyone. We appreciate everyone jumping on to join us for a short conversation with Lindsey Burke. Of course, we have Corey on. He's the executive director at EFI, the director of school choice at the Reason Foundation, and adjunct scholar at Cato Institute. But our special guest today is Lindsey Burke, and she is a board director at EFI. She's also the director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. And we're excited to have you, Lindsey. We know you're swamped lately. You've got tons of work going on, and so we're glad we could steal 30, 45 minutes of your time this morning to talk through how coronavirus is posing a lot of challenges for education these days. And it's not just K-12 education, obviously. We've seen the news, right? This goes all the way through higher ed. And something we don't talk a lot about, and it's not in the news a lot, is even preschool. And we won't talk much about that today, but there are a lot of families that rely on that for their young kids. So anyway, we're going to start. We're going to just start off with a question, and we'll let the conversation kind of take us where it goes. And we have a little bit of source material pulled up that Corey will drive as we talk. But if I can, I want to just start with one question, and it's a very broad one. Just what's your take, Lindsey, on just generally speaking in the United States, coronavirus plus education equals what? What does the landscape look like right now?
Yeah, so that could be answered in all kinds of ways. I think for school districts, there's one answer. For parents, there's another answer. For kids, there's another answer. And for taxpayers, there's another answer, right? On the school district side, I think they're facing two issues right now. It's the immediacy of getting content to kids, whether that is content that a teacher's delivering, calling into students, providing packets, whatever it might be. But then they're also clearly worried about the medium term impact, which will be the impact to their bottom line. And that's just not public school districts, right? That's the impact to charter schools. It's the impact to private schools. It's the impact of private school choice programs that we're going to see moving forward. If you think about how education financing is structured, right? We all know roughly how it's structured, right? It's about 45-45 state local revenue split, about 8.5% at the federal level, where federal taxpayers are providing the revenue for K-12 schools across the country. But the vast majority of revenue is state and locally driven. And that local revenue tends to come in large part from property taxes and sales taxes. The sales tax piece is the killer right now. So governments have had to tell businesses that they need to close their doors largely during the coronavirus. So those businesses are not generating revenue, and that's not filling up the sales tax coffers that public schools will rely on in the fall. And so that's going to be a real ding to their revenue source. And so, that's going to impact, for better or for worse, how the federal government's thinking about its role with K-12 financing, how states think about what they will have to backfill in terms of that lost sales tax revenue. So that's going to create some real conversations over the next few weeks, I think, about how schools make up for that. And then I would just say, on the private school side, the calculus is different, right? So they have individuals who are paying directly out of pocket, right? If we're talking about just private schools, not private school choice programs. So those families, we've heard this a lot, are calling their private schools and saying, can I access my kid's education that I'm paying for, or can I get a refund? And so private schools are being super responsive, providing that educational content. But they are worried, of course. I mean, there are, impacts that are concentrated in certain areas. So some sectors of private schools are feeling it more than others. But I think that the big question now, particularly for those who are interested in school choice, is, what does the impact look like on some of these private school choice programs moving forward, right? To go back to that issue that I started with, that businesses are having to shut down, do they have the revenue to contribute to scholarship granting organizations at the same level they did before? To what extent is that going to impact the number of scholarships that are available in the fall? So there are all of these really serious revenue questions right now that I think are probably, second to schools delivering content to kids, the most immediate thing that they're thinking about right now.
So, Lindsey, we've seen a lot of studies about how private school choice programs in particular save states money. Do you think that could be, an appealing aspect of private school choice going forward as a result of COVID-19? And then also, do you think there are any other reasons why school choice in particular could be an appealing policy going forward, or even right now in the short term? Do you have any?
Part of the problem that we are in is a function of the way that our education system is designed, right? The reason why families are having difficulty accessing content and accessing content equitably among, all families from different socioeconomic groups is that we assign kids to physical school buildings, and they are publicly managed, and they are not nimble. Private school choice options and charter schools for that matter, the charter sector, like Success Academy, is doing a fantastic job right now delivering content to kids. But the private school financing world is much more nimble than this assignment by zip code to public schools, right? To government schools. And so I think that that's a big consideration. I'm hopeful, right, that in some little way that this will help catalyze a longer term conversation among school officials and among families about whether or not the system that has evolved over a century is not nimble and not working well. And can we think about funding kids in that systems? Hey, that's our tagline.
I wish I had our my shirt on, my EFI shirt. I'd show
right.
it.
So I do, people, and despite every terrible thing that is coming out of this pandemic right now, that is a bit of a policy silver lining, is that we see more of an appetite for funding that is nimble, and the way that we get more nimble funding is to make it all student-centered and portable.
So do you think in the very short run, like right now, there should be a school choice implication, or is this more long-term of a solution where, if money could follow the student in the future, perhaps schools would have a better incentive to actually, get things right when anything goes wrong?
So I think good policy during a pandemic is also good policy long-term, right? So it so happens that the policies that we have worked on for a long time, right, advancing education choice, have become critical in this moment. Every state right now should be thinking about, can we provide emergency education savings accounts to families? Families right now are having to pay for physical school buildings that their children cannot attend. The doors are closed, right? So they should have access to that money for the remainder of the school year in an emergency way. The money that would have been spent on their child in that public system, to give it to families in the form of an education savings account that is populated with a prorated amount of the remaining state per pupil funding that would have been spent on that child in their public school. At that point, once families have that ESA funding, and by the way, I would add that a lot of the organizations, the companies that manage the sort of back end of ESAs, they are nimble and they can have these things up and running in a week. And so providing families with their share of funding for the remainder of the school year, and then enabling them to pay for private tutors that are virtual tutors for online learning courses. If a child has special needs, for online instruction that is a good fit for them, behavioral therapy, et cetera. So provide families with those emergency ESAs. In the states, the 5 states that already have them, they should do 2 things right away. They should lift any sort of cap that's there and enable every kid to be eligible. All the 5 states that have ESAs right now, they're targeted, they're provided to specific populations, right? So think, kids with special needs or kids in active duty military families. They should expand that to every kid. And then the second thing they should do is they should open the enrollment period so that it's just open all year long, so kids can apply for an ESA at any point during the school year.
So just real quick, Matthew, just for clarification for the listeners. So with the emergency ESA idea, and I think I'm getting this correctly, I think this is what I kind of proposed for California to do as a response as well. Just to make sure we're on the same page, is this, let's imagine your state, the rest of the school year is closed. Let's say it's a couple of months, like 20% of the school year, X amount of money should have, without disruption, would have went to the brick and mortar government run school. Let's say that's $3,000. With the emergency ESA, that money follows the child, right? So the child could stay in that government run school if they provide good virtual options.
Right. That's exactly right.
Otherwise, they'd have the option to take some of that money. And I think you're proposing 90%, so just to help the brick and mortar schools kind of adjust to the crisis. Okay, Matthew?
Yeah, so this is an interesting point that you bring up, Lindsey. You said it a couple of minutes ago. Yesterday, we talked with Patricia Levesque from Foundation for Excellence in Education, and she brought up something really important, I think, about Florida, and that was really the main thrust of our entire conversation yesterday, was how Florida was responding. The states that have already put into place certain measures, certain flexibility, right, for students and families, were way ahead of the curve on this, and they were so much better prepared, even though they didn't necessarily know what was coming, right? They weren't prepared for a pandemic on purpose. They were prepared in a way that just, they had already put into place certain measures on a statewide basis that allowed for flexibility for kids, so that when this did happen a few weeks ago, they were ready. And they just said, well, we have the structure, we know what we're doing, we just need to add capacity. And that was the only problem. Where you have other states, most of the states in the country, that don't even have the structure in place, they can't scale up because there's nothing to scale up. So I think you bring up a really great point there, that good education policy in a pandemic is good education policy in the long run. And that means flexibility. And that's where Florida has really been able to shine. And where, for all of its flaws, and we can talk about those, New York Success Academies has really shined, but that's because of the good policies they do have, right, that allowed Success Academies to do what they're doing. So anyway, I just wanted to really put a fine point on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And, obviously it shouldn't require some of these insane circumstances that nobody could have predicted, right? Coronavirus, Katrina in New Orleans, in order to catalyze reform. But this is what we've seen as a response, right? When some of these major external issues happen, that we see systems move toward choice in order to provide access to families. And so that is why I say it's just good policy. Currently, it's good policy in emergency situations, and it's good policy at any time.
Yep.
So I'll start bringing up some of these questions from the listeners as they come up. It looks like we have an interesting two-part question from Allison coming through YouTube. Do you expect to see the number of families homeschooling to rise post-COVID-19? I guess that's the first part of the question. And then secondly, will that help offset the lack of revenue coming into public schools and school choice programs?
So it's a really interesting question. The second part in particular. The first part is sort of a wait and see, right? We could see two things happen. We could see, and I hope this is what we see, that parents say, wow, I can do this. This is great. Homeschooling, that is. There are all of these tools out there to help me. I'm not alone, trying to do this without any help whatsoever. There are fantastic resources online. There are homeschooling co-ops. And of course, it goes without saying, what's happening now is like emergency schooling at home. It's not normal homeschooling, right? But it may give some families a taste of homeschooling and the confidence, I guess, to do it long term. Now, I don't think we're going to see a large-scale disruption of the traditional system as a result of this necessarily. Maybe, but I doubt it. Because for a lot of families, they're going to say the opposite. They're going to be like, no way, man, that was not right for me. That was a ton of work. It's just not the right fit for my child. It doesn't comport with my day job typically. So, I think we're going to see probably a lot of that, right? So I think it's important to know the numbers up front so we can compare long-term the effect that we're seeing. We've got about 1.6 million kids, 1.7 almost million kids across the country homeschooling today. That's about 3.3% of the overall K-12 age population. If you add in, there were already about 300,000 kids who were doing fully online virtual charter schools before the pandemic hit. And then we have total about 22,000 kids across the country in education savings account programs. Some of those kids use their ESA like a traditional scholarship, and they just go to private schools with it. But we estimate about a third of those kids use it to school at home and never enter a brick and mortar school. So that's about 7,500 kids. But overall, we're still right under 2 million kids total that are doing something already pre-pandemic that sort of looks like homeschooling or is homeschooling. So we'll see if that number moves.
So what you're saying is we're pretty much around 4% now, if you add all those together, or a little less?
I would say it's probably more like 3.5%.
3.5%.
Yeah.
And so if I had to press you and ask you, hey, if you want to make a bet within the next 5 years, what do you think the homeschool or this mix of populations would be relative to today?
Ooh,
if you had to make a guess.
I am a betting man.
I'm not going to bet. It's too difficult. But I am just curious as to what you think realistically might happen.
Well, I would say realistically that it would not be out of the realm of possibility to see that number go up to 5%. And that might not sound like a huge increase, but that would be a significant increase, right, of the number of kids homeschooling to go from roughly 3 to 5. I can see that happening. I don't think we're going to see, 20, 30% of kids homeschooling in the next year or two. Now, ask me again in 10 years, and maybe we will.
Well, okay, so same question, but what if we had universal education savings accounts?
And so I think that's the more likely scenario, not necessarily as a result of this pandemic, but just policies moving in that direction, right? ESAs have only been a thing since 2011, right? So Arizona starts the first ESA program in 2011, and today we have 5 states with ESAs. That, I know that might not sound that impressive, but in the realm of policy, right, and the creation of new ways of delivering programs, that's a lot. Is that radar talking? That's a lot.
No.
That's a lot of movement. So I do think that's what we're going to see long term, right? Is that, and we already see this in the states. States that are thinking about doing school choice programs, they're thinking ESAs now. I mean, I love a good voucher program as much as the next person, but at this point, like, go with an ESA. It is the more flexible, more nimble, more refined version of a traditional school voucher option.
So for the listeners, would you say the main difference between vouchers and education savings accounts is that a voucher is school choice, whereas an education savings account is education choice? Are there any other differences?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And at this point, we try to say education choice, right? For that reason, more than school choice even, because we're at the point, everything in American life is nimble and customized, right? We order our food online. We pick our channels if we can, if we're not locked into a cable situation. But we try to pick and customize every single thing in life. We customize the way that we evaluate things, right? Like, you can choose, if you're picking a restaurant, this is a point Jason Bedrick makes, that there are different modes, different levels of evaluating something. You can go on Yelp and you can see what other folks have said about a restaurant, or you can go to something that's slightly more, vetted, if you will. You can go to something like Urban Spoon. And then if you want the expert vetter for a restaurant, you get a Michelin guide. Does this restaurant have a Michelin star?
We have lots of those in DC.
So I think we're even getting to the point where we're going to customize how we evaluate educational quality, which is where we would ultimately want to go. We would want to crowdsource the opinions of families about the experience they've had. But then you also may want some sort of expert review, right? Other organizations who have put their seal of approval on either a school or some sort of school content. And that's something that ESAs enable, not that vouchers don't, but ESAs enable a more granular level of evaluation, right? Hypothetically, in Tennessee, families with an ESA are going to be able to rate their provider on their cell phone before they get that next quarter's distribution of ESA funding. I mean, that's great, right? We want family-sourced accountability and family-directed accountability, and that's something that ESAs catalyze.
So with the traditional public school system, the main form of accountability is essentially standardized test scores, right? Where, kids take a written or online test for math and reading and other subjects, and then, either, the schools are rewarded or punished for that or not.
They're not punished.
Yeah,
for
I mean, so it's just
you get more money.
Yeah, sometimes they get more money because they're failing, because they need the money in order to do better. But so if we applied that to the restaurant industry, would that be like, I don't know, a bureaucrat coming in and saying, well, this food has too many calories and we're going to shut the restaurant down? Or
Right. And this is a question we get a lot, right? I mean, what you would want, if to use the restaurant analogy, the government's role in that is more analogous to some sort of government entity giving that ABC rating, right? You don't have roaches in the kitchen. It's up to fire code, like the bare bones stuff. And that's fine. And that can apply and should apply in the ed space too, right? You want to make sure the building that you're using is a sturdy building. But the actual content and the academic rigor and the quality and the value that you're getting, that needs to be evaluated by the people to whom the service is being delivered, right? So that needs to be evaluated by the parent and by the child, right? And by other teachers, right? So we've got to reframe how we think about accountability and shift accountability to the people that it matters to, and that's the families. Give them the ability to vote with their feet when it's not working, because that's the incentive structure you need to make sure that we do see improvements overall.
That's good. That's great. So I have another question here for you. We talked a lot about some of these potential solutions, ESAs, vouchers, emergency ESAs. Are there any, Lindsey, that you know of, any of these potential solutions that actually have a good shot at making it, at becoming policy, whether it's at a state level or even nationally or whatever that looks like? What's your feel for how that's progressing or not?
Yeah, so the state level conversations, I think, are going to unfold maybe a little more slowly than the federal level conversation, just because there's so much focus right now at the national level because of the pandemic. So despite the fact that the federal government is a very small financial stakeholder, it has no constitutional role to be involved in education, despite all of that, we are seeing a fair amount of conversations at the federal level about what can happen now. Are we in a unique situation where there is more of a basis for some sort of federal involvement? I'm not saying that's the case or should be the case, but that's the conversation. There are things that are appropriate that are under conversation at the federal level, at the national level. So first, I would say it's the waiver issue. So that's something that is totally appropriate. And again, I would argue good policy that should be long-term policy. Secretary DeVos has offered waivers to states to get out of the testing requirements, which makes complete sense right now, right? I mean, there is no way that you can expect a state and a school district to say, we're going to test kids as we normally would in the sort of typical, schooling environment and hold schools accountable for those test results. That's just completely inappropriate in this moment that we're in. So she's offered waivers there, and that makes sense. The Federal Department of Education has put out notices saying that schools are totally free to offer instruction online. And even if that means that they cannot assure that every single child can access that instruction, that they should still move toward online instruction and then work to make sure that that online instruction is widely available. So those are the sort of immediate responses we've seen. There are other conversations happening about what should happen in the funding space, and that's really important. With existing federal funding, the key word there being existing, should the federal government offer micro grants to states? And I would say that that should take the form of something like Title I, which is all the federal money for low-income school districts, Title I dollars being portable, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act funding, IDEA dollars for students with special needs being portable to follow students to education options of choice online. And then I think, Matt, to answer your question, within the realm of what's possible, I do think both of those things are possible, portability of existing federal funding. Also, the 529 savings accounts, right? These used to just be available for college, right? Your 529 college savings account. In case you missed it, as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act a couple of years ago now, that was also expanded to K-12 schools. So you can also use your 529 savings accounts to pay for K-12 schools. What you can't yet do, though, is use it for homeschooling. That's something, I mean, in my opinion, that is low-hanging fruit that Congress should immediately and could immediately do. Extend those 529 savings account uses to homeschooling expenses. So I think that's within the realm of possibility. I think the micro grant piece is within the realm of possibility. Right now, Congress is considering the second phase of small business loans, so we'll see what happens there.
Could you touch on these micro grants just for the listeners for some additional clarification? Are these essentially just school choice at the federal level, or what sources of funding would this entail?
Yeah.
Do you have any more information on that? I think it's been kind of unclear up to now, but
Yeah, I think that we're still waiting on details as to what the department is thinking about right now. And then, of course, something at this level would likely require going through Congress to achieve. So we'll just have to see how that develops over the next couple of weeks.
So,
okay, cool. Well, I wanted to ask if you want to add your 2 cents, Lindsey, on, if it looks like this, would you support the micro grant, or if it looks another way? Do you think it's a good idea based on what you've heard so far?
So there are two things that kind of bind how I think about appropriateness in this environment, right? This pandemic environment. One is any policy, and this goes beyond education policy, but any policy at the federal level needs to be targeted and temporary and tied to the virus, right? So those are what should sort of frame our thinking for how we respond to this with all policy. That goes with education policy too. I would extend that to say that to the greatest extent possible right now, anything, a micro grant, whatever it might be, should leverage existing federal dollars. There are a lot of existing federal education dollars that are out there. Mm-hmm. We spend $16 billion annually on Title I. Mm-hmm. That's for low-income districts. We spend, another $13 billion, I think we're at right now, for IDEA funding for kids with special needs. There are dozens upon dozens of other federal programs at the Department of Education. Many are duplicative, most are totally inappropriate. Many lack any sort of efficacy. Thinking about, in this moment in time, consolidating those programs and providing those funds to states. One approach that I would support would be something known as A+. What that would do is that would basically allow states to opt out of all of these federal programs and put all of those existing federal dollars toward any education purpose defined under state law. I think that would be an excellent form for the micro grants to take, to basically allow states to opt out, provide them their share of federal education dollars, and allow them to put it toward any lawful education purpose under state law.
Okay, so with the Title I and federal school lunch programs, so like, for example, how would that work out? Would it be if you're at a Title I school, that family gets that portion of funding for an education savings account, and then same thing, like if your child does qualify for the free and reduced lunch, they would get like a SNAP benefit, or?
Yeah. So a couple of different things. If they went, if Congress, along with the administration, went the route of portability, so I think it would look a lot like what you described. So based on the existing either Title I or IDEA funding formula at the federal level, the money that a kid generates through that funding formula would be sent to the state, at which point the state would provide an education savings account to the eligible family for the amount that they generate through the existing formula. So that would be the portability approach for both Title I and IDEA. The A+ approach, which I would say is we're in strange times, but if we're kind of thinking front and center with federalism, if we go the A+ approach, then basically you're talking all of the federal money under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA. You all know it better as No Child Left Behind, but it's now called ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. All of that money would go to a state. So that would include Title I, IDEA, and all of the other programs under ESEA. So about, 20 other programs roughly. That would go to states, at which point Florida could say, we want to take our grant, our federal grant, and put it into a tax credit scholarship program in Florida. Arizona could say we're going to put in their ESA program if they want it. Texas could say we want to bolster reading programs online for kids during the pandemic. So a state could use it for any lawful education purpose under state law.
Mm-hmm. So it's essentially just allowing for more flexibility with existing federal funding. And I think the Department of Ed did something like that recently, right? Where they allowed for more flexibility for virtual education and technology spending. Yeah. But this would be even more flexibility than that.
This would be broader, yeah.
So we've been talking. want to say we've been talking a lot about, things that could be done and how school choice could be, and more flexibility could be something that helps us get past the pandemic, and to help the education system overall. Are there any issues going on in particular states that have blocked families from being able to adjust to the virus, to be able to access virtual schooling? Can you talk about a couple of those scenarios? I know you've written about it with Inez from IWF.
Yeah. I mean, Inez and I have a piece out today that's on the wire. So a bunch of different papers are picking it up across the country. But basically, in a nutshell, this is special interests never sleep, right? Like even during a pandemic, the unions are still out in full force trying to block access in some instances to online learning options for students. And of course, this is because they see it as something that could be a longer term threat to the stranglehold that they have on the traditional public education system. So they are trying to block it in places like Alaska and Oregon and Washington and California and states across the country. We're seeing the union do what they always do, which is try to block reforms to the system. So we outlined that today, and
which state do you think is the worst out of the ones that you've listed? And
I mean, I would say maybe it's a tie. I would say maybe it's Oregon at this point, but followed by Washington State. They, both of those states have had struggles trying to their credit, get learning options to kids during this time, right? Deliver it virtually online. But then, unfortunately, Oregon in particular just sort of kowtowing to the teachers union. The teachers union said, we don't want to move stuff online. We don't want to allow kids to enroll in public online charter schools. And the state said, okay, we'll prevent that from happening. So there was, I forget what the number was, but
1,600.
Yeah, 1,600 kids had applied to a virtual school, the Connections Academy in Oregon. And the unions, at the behest of the unions, the state said, nope, we're halting all applications. You're out of luck.
And before any of this went down, before March 27th, this would have been okay, right? You would have been able to switch to the virtual school. It's just that now that there's an emergency, the government in Oregon or the Department of Education has said, no, too bad, you can't switch. I actually went to the Oregon Connections Academy website and went to their enrollment page, and it actually shows that nope, too bad.
Wow.
Due to the executive order, too bad you can't you can't enroll at this time, which is sad. Imagine being a teacher or an individual family trying to come to this website to enroll your kid because look, your brick and mortar school isn't providing education right now. If that's the case, you come to this website and oh dang, the government says I can't do that because whatever the reason is. I don't. Maybe it's the unions. Maybe it's something else. Wall Street Journal said it was because
the Wall Street Journal says it's the unions, and I believe them.
Yep, they're typically right.
Yep.
Wow. So I don't know if you saw there too, but you can't withdraw from virtual school either right now. On that page you pulled up, Corey.
Complete freeze.
Right. It's just like total enrollment freeze. Well, Lindsey, we're getting near the time when we promised we'd let you go. We just have a few minutes left. So maybe in the few minutes we do have left, what's on your mind right now in this space? What should we be paying attention to that we're not, or anything that you feel just isn't getting the attention that it needs, whether at state or even national level?
Yeah, I think higher ed is maybe not getting the attention that it needs right now. There are major financing implications for K-12 schools, higher ed is really going to feel the pinch moving forward. Rick Hess over at AEI had a good piece up on this a couple of days ago now, just thinking through the student perspective. If you're a kid right now and you've been accepted into a college for the fall that you fought so hard to get into, Are you thinking maybe I'll take a gap year so that I kind of get the full college experience? Because a lot of colleges right now are thinking for the fall semester, do they just go online for the fall? Even some of the elite universities. So are kids going to think about deferring for a year in order to get that sort of traditional college experience with all the bells and whistles that they all pay so much for? And then what will the impact be on college revenue in the fall? I forget who it was, but somebody had pointed out that a lot of universities, mid-tier universities that don't have large endowments, they sort of rely on lines of credit to get them through. That there are two big points in time when colleges receive revenue, right? It's fall semester starts, spring semester starts. And if they're not getting that revenue, they can usually float that line of credit and do okay until that revenue comes in from their tuition. And that could be a struggle for them. The other thing that I thought was interesting in Rick's article was, he points out that the way that colleges evaluate candidates, students for acceptance will have to fundamentally change next year, because at the K-12 level, we're not assessing kids, right? The SAT and ACT have totally shut down. I love the classical learning test, and it's fantastic, and it's still up and running, and kids can use that. As much as I love that, though, at the moment, at least, the ACT and the SAT still dominate. And so there are going to be a lot of students who don't have that as a factor for admissions officers to consider. Kids aren't in K-12 schools right now, so they're not participating in sports right now. So they're not going to, the sort of higher end high school athletes aren't going to have their sports sort of outcomes to provide to admissions officers either. There could even be things like, an impact on the way in which a kid's able to get a letter of recommendation. So all of these things are going to factor into how colleges have to think about sort of reconfiguring their admissions processes for at least another year. And what will the impact be? Rick had a really provocative idea in that piece that I mentioned, which was maybe this year colleges just move to an open lottery process. There's not a sort of merit-based evaluation process in place that they do what some of the great public charter schools do, which is just let's have a lottery and then see how it all shakes out. And then we can see, from a research perspective, that's interesting, right? We can see, does the value add that Harvard purports to have, is that really there, right? So that's, like I said, provocative, but it's very interesting to think about. So I don't know, I think higher ed's kind of the underreported conversation right now. So something to keep our eyes on.
I think it's interesting, you rewind 12 years, right? And we're in 2008. And if you remember what happened to colleges and universities, you talked about the mid-tier colleges and universities around the country. There were a lot of them that just had to shutter their doors.
Right, and we may see more of that.
Yeah, I mean, that you're right. We haven't talked a lot about that in this space, even nationally. I mean, there's not a lot of talk about that. Every once in a while, you'll see an article come out, but the big deal is the 70+ million K-12 kids, right? Mm-hmm. But just by sheer numbers. But there are a lot of kids, a lot of folks in colleges and universities too that are having to deal with all of this craziness just like everyone else.
Yeah, and I mean, look, higher ed needs reform, right? Like, there's an argument to be made that there is a glut, right, in some respects to the, especially the lower end and higher ed of the number of colleges. But I would say that this current situation is not the way toward reform that folks had envisioned, right? Like, again, higher ed needs reform, but being forced to close because of the effects of the pandemic, I think, is unfortunate. And I don't know. So we'll see what happens in the fall moving forward.
Good. Well, hey, we're right there. We need to let you go, but thank you
so much for having me.
Yeah, it was great to have you, Lindsey. It's good to see you across the country. But hope you stay well. You're feeling well, I heard earlier, so hope you stay well. And Corey, thanks for jumping on this morning too. It was good to have a conversation.
Yeah, thanks for setting all this up. And yeah, of course, it's always great to have Lindsey on, and hopefully we can talk again soon.
Yeah, thanks, fellas.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good one.